Okay, imagine this. A young eye doctor, trained in London no less. Suddenly, bam, he's in the middle of a brutal dictatorship. It all happens after his brother dies. Tragic death. That's just the start of Bashar al-Assad's story. And that's where our deep dive takes us today, into this guy's life, his rule, and all the crazy events that led to his fall from power, like just days ago.
It's a story that's got the whole world watching, and for good reason. We're talking power, ambition, the really awful stuff that happens when a dictator controls a country.
We've gone through a ton of stuff, articles, reports, even history books, all to give you the whole picture. From how the Assad dynasty came to be to the bloody civil war that ripped Syria apart.
What's really interesting is how Assad's own life kind of reflects Syria's messed up history.
So rewind time a bit. To get Bashar, we got to start with his dad, Hafez al-Assad.
Hafez, he shaped modern Syria, good and bad. He took over in a coup, 1971, and he didn't waste time, solidified his power, used the Ba'ath Party a lot, that pan-Arab socialist movement.
The Ba'ath Party, right, rings a bell, but give me a quick recap. What are they all about?
Think of them as secular nationalist. Their goal, unify the Arab world under socialism. They got power in a bunch of countries, but their whole ideology often ended up with, well, authoritarian rule. In Syria, Hafez, he used the party to make a one-party state. Crushed any opposition ruthlessly.
And didn't he use, like, sectarianism to make his power even stronger?
Exactly. Syria's mostly Sunni Muslim, but Hafez, he was Alawite, a sect of Shia Islam. So he packed the government and military with Alawites. All the power went to a small group, really tight-knit.
So there's this built-in tension, right? The majority Sunnis, they're feeling left out.
Exactly. That tension, it simmered for decades, and then boom, erupted into all that violence we've seen recently.
And then you've got Bashar al-Assad walking into this mess. The reluctant heir, that's what they called him. This guy's training to be an eye doctor in London. A world away from all the political drama in Damascus. Can you imagine? Eye doctor to dictator. What a career change.
It's pretty wild, right? He wasn't supposed to be the leader. It was his older brother, Basil, who was being prepped for the job. But then, 1994, Basil dies in a car crash, and everything changes.
Suddenly, Bashar's back from London, thrown right into the power struggle. His dad doesn't mess around, puts him through the military ranks, gives him control of the Syrian occupation of Lebanon, been going on since the 70s.
But even with all that training, people doubted if Bashar could be like his dad. He wasn't as ruthless, didn't have that same charisma, couldn't command total loyalty like his father. He had to build his own alliances, get rid of some of the old guard, shift the power around.
And it seems like at first he tried to do things his own way, right?
Yeah.
I remember reading about the Damascus Spring, this little moment of hope where it felt like Syria might open up.
Yeah, the early 2000s, there was this possibility. Bashar, he allowed some, limited political and social freedoms, got people talking about democratic reforms, more transparency. But it didn't last long.
So what happened? Why did it fizzle out so fast?
Yeah, some say Bashar was never really serious about reforms. He cracked down on dissent, arrested activists and intellectuals. Others say he was up against the hardliners in the regime. The old guard, they saw any change as a threat. Whatever the reason, the Damascus Spring was crushed, and Syria went right back to authoritarianism.
And then, not even a few years later,
Yeah.
you've got the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, 2005. Huge explosion, shook the whole region.
Yeah, that event really cast a shadow over Bashar's rule. He denied any involvement, of course. But lots of people in Lebanon and internationally, they blame Syria. That assassination led to the Cedar Revolution, forced Syria to pull its troops out of Lebanon after almost 30 years of occupation.
Feels like a turning point, doesn't it? All that
Yeah.
international pressure, the accusations, it must have really impacted Assad and his regime.
Absolutely. It made him even more isolated on the world stage. Made him look like a ruthless dictator, someone who'd use violence to get rid of his enemies, and it set the stage for even more trouble. It was like a powder keg just waiting for a spark. And that spark came in 2011 with the Arab Spring uprisings.
The whole region was a mess. Protests, revolutions, demands for democracy from Tunisia to Egypt and beyond. You could feel these old authoritarian regimes starting to crumble.
And in Syria, it started peacefully. Demonstrations, people inspired by what was happening elsewhere. They wanted change, no more corruption, more political freedom.
But Bashar al-Assad, his response was brutal.
He went full-on repression. Tanks, live ammo, even airstrikes against civilians. It was horrifying, shocked the world, and Syria was plunged into a full-blown civil war.
And it wasn't just Assad against his opponents, right? It became this tangled mess of different groups, all with their own goals and loyalties. Hard to even keep track of everyone involved.
You're telling me. All right, let's try to break down the main groups that were against Assad. First, you had the pro-democracy activists. These were the people who first hit the streets. Inspired by the Arab Spring, they wanted freedom and self-determination.
They were the ones risking it all, protesting, documenting the regime's brutality, getting the word out to the world.
Exactly, but they were often outgunned, outmaneuvered by Assad's military. As things escalated, many of these activists, they were forced into exile, killed, or imprisoned.
And then there's the armed rebel groups, a mixed bag, right? Some wanted a more democratic Syria, others had more extreme ideas.
Right, you had groups like the Free Syrian Army. They got some support from the West early on. They were seen as the moderate opposition, fighting for a secular democratic state. But as the war went on, they fractured, couldn't stay united.
And then on the other side,
Yeah.
you had groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, connected to al-Qaeda with a much harder Islamist agenda.
Yeah, these extremist groups made everything even more complicated, blurred the lines between those fighting for legitimate reasons and those who just wanted to exploit the chaos and impose their own theocratic state.
And then you can't forget the Kurds in all this. They were a major force in the Syrian civil war.
Absolutely. The Kurds, they've faced oppression in Syria for a long time, denied basic rights, discrimination under the Assad regime. They saw the uprising as a chance to fight for more autonomy, formed their own militias, the biggest one being the People's Protection Units, or YPG.
And they ended up controlling a big chunk of territory in northeastern Syria, right? Basically created their own autonomous region, called it Rojava.
It's a really interesting story. They went with direct democracy, feminist principles, multi-ethnic coexistence, and they were doing all this while fighting ISIS, who saw them as a huge threat.
They were America's boots on the ground against ISIS, weren't they? Seems like a weird alliance, considering the YPG also has ties to the PKK, which Turkey and the U.S. consider a terrorist organization.
It shows just how complicated this conflict was. The Kurds were both America's best partner against ISIS and a source of tension with Turkey, a NATO ally. They were always juggling these competing interests, trying to find a place for themselves in all the chaos.
It really was a proxy war with everyone involved, wasn't it? Russia and Iran backing Assad, the U.S. and others supporting various rebel groups, Turkey focused on the Kurds. How did all that foreign involvement shape things?
Well, it definitely made the war last longer. Syria became a battleground for these global powers, each one with their own goals.
Russia, they were Assad's lifeline. Air power, ground troops, tons of military equipment, kept his regime going.
Yeah, if Putin hadn't stepped in, Assad probably would have fallen much sooner.
And Iran, they were key too, funding and arming pro-Assad militias, including Hezbollah, that powerful Lebanese Shia group.
Iran saw Syria as crucial to their plans in the region, a key part of what some called the Shia Crescent, from Tehran to Beirut. They were determined to keep that influence no matter what.
What about the U.S.? We were kind of in and out of the conflict, supporting some rebel groups, then pulling back, always worried about getting stuck in another Middle Eastern war.
Yeah, the U.S. involvement was, well, hesitant. Some would say it was a bit of a mess. They wanted Assad out, but they were also worried about extremist groups getting stronger in the opposition. Kind of created this standstill. They never fully committed to one strategy.
And then there's Turkey. They were all about the Kurdish issue, willing to fight both ISIS and the YPG, saw both as threats to their security.
And that intervention just made things more complex, caused friction with the U.S., added more violence and instability. It's a perfect example of how all these different goals turned Syria into a geopolitical time bomb.
And in the middle of all this, you've got Assad holding on to power. Like he doesn't care about the international condemnation, the war crimes accusations, the terrible human cost of the war.
It really shows how ruthless he was, willing to do whatever it took to stay in control. He used sectarianism, turned Alawites against Sunnis, exploited the divisions in the opposition, and relied heavily on his foreign backers.
But even with all that, his power wasn't absolute.
Yeah.
Which brings us to what happened these past few weeks. That rebel offensive that swept through Syria, ending with Assad fleeing to Russia, feels like the end of an era. But the big question is, what happens now?
Yeah, it really does feel like a turning point, a before and after.
So we've got this powder keg, right? Syria in the early 2010s. And then, boom, the Arab Spring.
It was like wildfire spreading across the region, protests, revolutions, people demanding change, democracy. Those old regimes, they were starting to shake in their boots.
And Syria was right in the thick of it.
It began with, peaceful demonstrations, people inspired by what they saw happening elsewhere. They wanted to end corruption, more political freedom, that kind of thing.
But Assad, well, he wasn't exactly going for peaceful solution.
No, his response was brutal, to say the least. Think tanks rolling through the streets, live ammunition, even airstrikes targeting civilians. It was a horrific escalation, really shocked the world.
And just like that, Syria was in a full-blown civil war.
It became this incredibly complex conflict, so many different groups all fighting with their own agendas and allegiances.
Yeah, it's hard to even keep track of who's who.
Absolutely. It's a real tangled web.
Okay.
Let's try to break it down a bit, see if we can make sense of it. So first, you've got the pro-democracy activists. These were the folks who initially took to the streets. Inspired by the Arab Spring, they were demanding more freedom, more say in how their country was run.
They were the ones putting their lives on the line, protesting, documenting the regime's brutality, trying to get the word out.
Exactly, but they were often up against a much stronger force. Assad's military had better weapons, better training. As the conflict escalated, many of these activists were forced into exile. Or worse, they were killed or imprisoned.
And then there were the armed rebel groups. Some of them, at least at first, seemed to share the goals of the pro-democracy activists, wanting a more democratic Syria. But then you had other groups with much more extreme ideologies.
It was a real mixed bag. You had groups like the Free Syrian Army, or FSA. They were seen by some in the West as the moderate opposition, fighting for a secular democratic state. They even received some support from Western countries, at least initially.
But as the war dragged on, the FSA and other similar groups, they really struggled.
They fractured, they couldn't stay unified, and that's partly because the conflict became so chaotic, so brutal.
And of course, as the situation got worse, extremist groups saw an opportunity.
Groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or HTS with links to al-Qaeda, they had a much more hardline Islamist agenda. They weren't interested in democracy, they wanted to establish a theocratic state.
And their presence really muddied the waters, didn't it? Made it harder to distinguish between those fighting for legitimate grievances and those who just wanted to exploit the chaos to grab power.
Absolutely. It added another layer of complexity to an already incredibly complex situation.
And then we can't talk about the Syrian civil war without talking about the Kurds.
Right. The Kurds have been a major factor in this whole conflict.
They've faced discrimination and oppression in Syria for decades.
Under Assad, they were denied basic rights, treated as second-class citizens. So when the uprising began, they saw it as a chance to push for greater autonomy. They formed their own armed groups, the most prominent being the People's Protection Units, or YPG.
And they ended up controlling a significant chunk of territory in northeastern Syria, right?
They did. They carved out their own de facto autonomous region, which they called Rojava.
And what's interesting is that they established a system of governance that was quite different from anything else in the region.
Yeah, they embraced direct democracy, feminist principles, multi-ethnic coexistence.
All this while also fighting ISIS, who saw them as a major threat.
It's a remarkable story, really. They were caught in the middle of this incredibly complex conflict, fighting for their own survival and also trying to build a new society.
And they ended up being America's main partner in the fight against ISIS, didn't they?
They did, which is kind of ironic considering that the YPG also has ties to the PKK.
Which, of course, both Turkey and the U.S. consider a terrorist organization.
It just goes to show how complicated and messy this whole situation was. The Kurds were simultaneously America's most reliable ally against ISIS, and a source of tension with Turkey, a NATO ally.
So we've got all these internal divisions, these different groups vying for power, and then you layer on top of that all the foreign involvement. It really was a proxy war, wasn't it?
Absolutely. You had Russia and Iran backing Assad.
The U.S., Turkey, and various other countries supporting different rebel groups. It's a wonder anyone could make sense of it all.
It was a geopolitical mess. And all that foreign intervention had a huge impact on how the conflict played out.
So let's break it down. First, Russia, they were Assad's main lifeline, right?
Without a doubt. They provided air power, ground troops, tons of military hardware. They kept Assad's regime afloat when it looked like it was about to collapse.
So basically, if it wasn't for Putin, Assad would be long gone.
Most likely, yes.
And then there's Iran.
They were crucial too. They provided financial support, weapons, and training to pro-Assad militias, including Hezbollah, the powerful Lebanese Shia group.
So Iran was playing the long game, right? They saw Syria as a key part of their regional strategy.
Exactly. They wanted to maintain their influence in Syria, no matter what the cost.
And then there's the U.S. We were kind of all over the place, weren't we?
Well, our involvement was certainly less decisive than Russia's or Iran.
We supported some rebel groups, but we were always hesitant to get too deeply involved.
We wanted to see Assad go, but we were also worried about extremist groups gaining power, so we kind of ended up stuck in this middle ground, never fully committing to one strategy or another.
And then you've got Turkey, who are primarily focused on the Kurdish issue.
They saw the YPG as a threat to their national security, and they were willing to fight both ISIS and the YPG to protect their interests.
So Turkey's involvement just added another layer of complexity to an already chaotic situation.
It did, and it created friction with the U.S., who were backing the YPG in the fight against ISIS.
So you've got this incredibly complex war with all these different players, all these competing interests, all this bloodshed. And in the middle of it all, you've got Assad.
Somehow he managed to hold on to power for years, despite the international condemnation, the accusations of war crimes, the sheer scale of human suffering.
It's almost unbelievable.
He was ruthless. He was willing to do whatever it took to stay in control. He played on sectarian divisions. He exploited the weaknesses of the opposition. And he relied heavily on the support of his foreign backers.
But even with all that, his grip on power wasn't absolute. And that brings us to the dramatic events of the past few weeks, the rebel offensive that swept across the country and ultimately forced Assad to flee to Russia.
It was a stunning turn of events, one that few could have predicted.
So now the big question is, what happens next? What does the future hold for Syria?
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure. I mean, Syria's been through so much, it's tough to predict what'll happen.
It's crazy to think that Assad, someone who seemed so untouchable for so long, is now out of the picture. But as we've seen, Syria's story is always full of surprises.
And what's really interesting is that even with Assad gone, all the stuff that caused the conflict, those deep divisions, the regional power struggles, they haven't gone away.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the possibilities for Syria's future?
Well, the best case scenario, the one everyone's hoping for, I think, is a peaceful transition to democracy.
Okay, but what would that actually look like in a country that's been torn apart by war for so long?
Well, imagine a government that represents all of Syria's diverse groups: Sunnis, Alawites, Kurds, Christians, everyone. A government that's chosen through free and fair elections. And they'd need to create a new constitution, one that guarantees equal rights for all citizens and puts in place checks and balances to prevent another dictatorship.
It sounds great, but realistically, can you really see all these groups, after years of fighting, suddenly coming together and agreeing on a shared future?
It would be a huge challenge, no question. There's so much mistrust, so much pain and anger left over from the war. It would take strong leadership, both from within Syria and from the international community, to bring people together, to help them heal and rebuild trust.
It's not just about the political side of things, right? We're talking about a country that's been physically devastated, millions of people displaced, a whole generation scarred by violence.
Absolutely. Rebuilding Syria is going to be a monumental task. We're talking about massive investment in infrastructure, healthcare, education. It's going to require a huge commitment from the international community.
But even if all that happens, even if everyone's on board with this peaceful transition, there's still the issue of all those outside forces. Countries like Turkey, Iran, Russia, they've all been deeply involved in the conflict. Can we really expect them to just step back and allow a truly independent Syria to emerge?
That's the big unknown, isn't it? Those competing interests, they could easily derail any progress towards peace. You could see them trying to prop up their own favored factions within Syria, carving out spheres of influence, maybe even continuing to fuel proxy conflicts. It's a real recipe for ongoing instability.
So it sounds like peaceful transition is possible, but it's going to be a long and difficult road. What about some of the less optimistic scenarios? What if things don't go so well?
Well, one possibility is that Syria continues to fragment. We could see it becoming a patchwork of different territories, each controlled by a different group with no real central authority.
So basically a failed state.
Pretty much. You could have the Kurds consolidating their control in the northeast, Islamist groups vying for power in the northwest, and maybe remnants of the Assad regime holding on to parts of the coast. It would be a humanitarian disaster. Even more people would be displaced. The economy would be in ruins.
And in that kind of environment, extremist groups would thrive.
Absolutely. Groups like ISIS would exploit the chaos. They'd recruit fighters, launch attacks, and make the whole region even more unstable.
And then there's the most cynical, but maybe also the most realistic scenario.
What's that?
That a new authoritarian regime emerges from the ashes of the old one.
You're talking about another dictator?
Maybe someone from the old guard or someone backed by one of the foreign powers.
It would be a tragedy for the Syrian people to go through all that suffering only to end up back where they started.
It's a sobering thought. So we've got all these possibilities, all these uncertainties. What should we, as people trying to understand what's happening in Syria, what should we keep in mind as we watch this unfold?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this isn't just some abstract geopolitical game. This is about real people, millions of them, whose lives have been turned upside down by this war.
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture stuff, the power struggles, the political maneuvering, but we can't forget about the human cost.
We need to listen to the voices of the Syrian people, understand their experiences, their hopes, their fears. Those need to be at the forefront of any discussion about Syria's future.
And as we follow the news, as we try to make sense of what's happening, we need to do so with a critical eye.
Exactly. We can't just accept the narratives being pushed by those in power.
We need to demand accountability for the crimes that have been committed and advocate for a future where the Syrian people can finally live in peace.
Well said.
It's been a fascinating, albeit sobering, journey, exploring the complex and tragic story of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll continue to follow the situation closely and bring you more insights as they emerge.